Looking for makeup that's good for people and the planet? Say's range of award-winning products are both high performance and easy to use. Like their Glowy Super Gel, the ultimate effortless, no makeup glowing product. Available in 3 universal shades, it is a multi-use illuminator that hydrates and brightens skin for a fresh, dewy look. When applied, the skin immediately feels refreshed and looks lit from within without chunky glitter or shimmer. Shop Say Glowy Super Gel, now at Sephora.
This episode is brought to you by Ollie. Back to school means food changes. Early breakfasts, school lunches, after-school snacks, and let's not even talk about dinner. Ollie's here to help you cover all the wellness bases. From daily multivitamins to belly-balancing probiotics, Ollie's got your fam covered. Buy 3 and get 1 free with code BUNDLE24 at OLLY.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave us a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and X at Red Treehouse Pod. And if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. An important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Establishing friendships is a healthy part of human growth and development. Whether we're going out for a night on the town or staying at home for a low-key game night, most of us enjoy quality time with quality people. The activities are endless. But what matters as much as what we do, it's who we do it with. I'll admit, as I get to the end of my 30s in a few months, I value now, more than ever before, spending time with our closest friends. The desire for friendship isn't limited to teenagers and adults, though. Infants, toddlers, and children all desire close connection with others. It is developmentally healthy for them to build connections and relationships, which is why nearly 2 out of 3 children develop an imaginary friend or two before they turn 7 years old. Truly, this is both common and normal, and is a healthy part of childhood play. But is it possible that those imaginary friends, maybe even the one your own child plays with, are something otherworldly, even demonic? When my youngest son was a few years old, he started playing with an imaginary friend. Every so often, and lasting for a few months, we'd catch him talking to, waving at, and playing with his imaginary companion. At first, it didn't alarm us. After all, this was typical for a kid his age. But one night, while we were out, he was playing on a small stage platform a few inches above the ground. He was living his best life, running, jumping, tumbling, and laughing. Then, he stopped abruptly, turned to face behind him, stared off into the darkness of the backstage area at a door, waved, and said bye. Within a second or two, we saw the door open slightly, then close. My wife and I shot concerned glances at each other. The next day, we pulled him over and asked him about his imaginary friend. For a few minutes, he refused to give us the friend's name. But finally, after some convincing and a bribe for ice cream, he told us. His imaginary friend's name was Beezer. Our son described him as dark with sharp teeth. Nervous that Beezer was something malevolent, we calmly asked our son not to play with him anymore. He said okay. And that was it. We never heard about Beezer ever again. Recently, though, we asked him about Beezer. And while the name is familiar, because we bring it up every so often, he doesn't remember anything about him. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the darker, evil side of imaginary friends. What if evil and demonic spirits come in the form of imaginary friends and cozy up next to my and your kids? Is it possible that some imaginary companions are neither imaginary nor friendly? I'll give you the details. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Originally, it was thought children developed imaginary friends out of loneliness and the need for companionship. Psychologist G. Stanley Hall posed this theory in 1896, and though it has been long debunked, the myth endures to this day. A Psychology Today article titled, "Imaginary Friends, Harmful or Beneficial?" dated January 21st, 2020 states, quote, "Recently, Japanese researchers Yusuke Moriguchi and Naoya Todo found it more likely that children with imaginary companions are firstborns." End quote. I mentioned earlier that imaginary friends are a common and normal part of human growth and development. According to one article, quote, "Most research has shown that having an imaginary friend is a healthy form of childhood play. Studies have even found there may be some benefits for development in those children who create imaginary companions. Benefits include superior social cognition, more sociability, boosted creativity, better coping strategies, and increased emotional understanding." End quote. Overall, imaginary friends allow a child to experience friendship, support, and more. And it seems reasonable to say imaginary friends are a helpful addition to your child's life. Most of the time. What's fascinating about an imaginary friend is a child often interacts as if the friend is real. They can describe their appearance, clothing, hair, and more. They play with them as if they're there. They call them to join in adventures, complain when they don't do what the child wants, and blame them for misbehaving or when they get into trouble. A Psychology Today article titled "Imaginary Friends," dated January 31st, 2013 states, quote, "Imaginary friends can also help children to cope with fears, explore ideas, or gain a sense of competence through learning from and taking care of the imaginary friend." End quote. A literal figment of their imagination, these friends generally disappear as the child gets older. It almost seems silly to think about imaginary friends being demonic. But where science can explain why kids develop imaginary friends, and reassure parents about how common it is, science cannot explain who these imaginary friends really are. And it is possible, even likely, that some are not so imaginary and not so friendly. Horror movies have no doubt played into the idea of malevolent spirits masquerading as imaginary friends. They seem harmless at first, but over time, and with terrifying consequences, they display their evil, even murderous intentions. Let's consider several stories about the scary side of imaginary friends. Reddit user Polluted Blueberries posted, quote, "When I was small, I had a friend named Emily that lived in my closet. She wore a white dress, had long black hair, and a red ribbon. She always had her back to me when we would play or talk, and my Nana mentioned hearing me and another voice when I'd play with my Barbies. She would come in, and I would be alone. But Emily would be there with me, and my Nana assumed I was doing a funny voice. There was a time when I went down the street to another friend's house and watched Emily push the friend off the swing. The friend sprained her wrist, and I kept saying it wasn't me, that it was Emily. The friend's parents were very unhappy, and Nana said I was a liar. I told Emily that I was too old for imaginary friends, but she didn't like that. I would wake up on multiple occasions being pulled out of my bed by something holding my ankle. My bed faced the closet, and one night I finally saw her face. She didn't have eyes. They looked gouged out, and her mouth was sewn shut. Still, to this day, I cannot sleep with my closet door open. I've also seen her in a few other houses, not just my Nana's. I spent from age 12 to 18 permanently in foster care. In my junior year, I had finally been moved into my own bedroom. We were painting the walls, and for some reason the closet walls too. There were no small children in the house. We were all middle and high school age. But when I came home from school, I felt sick walking into my room. On the mirror, it looked like someone had blown their breath on it and wrote, "I can't eat." And there were child-sized handprints inside my closet that were physically impossible compared to everyone else in the house. My foster mom also felt that something was wrong when she walked into my room, and being a devout Christian, she punished me by calling me a Satanist and took away all non-Christian music and any clothes I owned that were black. No matter how much I tried to clean the mirror, that spot never went away. I could breathe on that spot, and the words would still be there. So I covered that part of the mirror with pictures. Over the rest of the time there, I would occasionally wake up with scratches all over me. She assumed I was doing it to myself, which always made me feel worse. Shortly before I graduated, her biological son, who was a sophomore at the time, was woken up to a girl in a white dress with long black hair and a red ribbon standing next to his bed. I'd never told anyone in the house what Emily looked like. Thankfully, I haven't seen her since my early 20s, but the trauma remains. I'm still afraid of the dark. I'm still afraid of closets. And I'm pretty sure she wasn't a ghost, but something far worse, due to the fact that she followed me through multiple houses throughout my younger years." End quote. Reddit user BBabyTurnsBlue posted, quote, "So for some context, I must have been about 4 when this happened, but I remember it all very clearly. I stayed with my grandparents every weekend from about 2 to 6 years old to to relieve my mother of some burden. She worked and went to school full-time back then, and I have 2 brothers who were 11 and 3 at the time. They could be a lot to handle. I, on the other hand, was a very quiet kid who had no problem keeping myself entertained, so it was easy for my elderly grandparents to watch me. I've always had issues with sleepwalking, and because of this, I had a small child's bed next to my grandparents' bed in their room. One night, as my grandparents were sound asleep snoring, I sat in bed and watched their small TV that sat atop the dresser. Suddenly, the TV shut off. No rhyme or reason. The remote control sat alone on the nightstand next to my grandmother. Oddly enough, I was not frightened by this at all. My child brain simply thought, oh, okay, the TV is off and it must be time to sleep. I laid back in bed and gathered the covers around my neck to get comfortable. But when I looked up, I noticed a tall figure standing in the corner of the room, illuminated perfectly by the streetlight pouring in through a window. He was of average height. However, he was wearing what I now understand to be a cloak, and his face was red with streaks of black that seemed to be flowing down from the crown of his head. I was startled, but again oddly not afraid by this man in my presence. Despite my lack of terror, I knew this man should not be there, and I tried to wake my grandparents. First, by calling their names. Then, jumping from my bed to theirs and shaking them both vigorously. They never woke and continued to snore lightly. Now, the unnatural nature of the situation started to hit me, and I began to worry something was wrong with my grandparents. Despite this, I still had no regard for my own safety. I looked back up at the man, and he had a hand outstretched, beckoning me. Then, he slowly began to glide towards the door that led out into the hall. After he disappeared out the door, I got out of bed slowly and began to follow him. To this day, I cannot explain why I did that, other than I had just had no fear of this odd-looking man. I followed him down the hall and into the kitchen. I saw him pass through the kitchen door to the living room. But when I got into the living room, he had disappeared. That's when the terror hit me. I felt extremely cold, and something horrible washed over me. I quickly ran back into my grandparents' bedroom and launched myself into their bed. They immediately woke, and I told them what happened, to which they both absolutely lost their mind. My Meemaw turned on all the lights in the whole house, and my Pop searched it top to bottom with a bat. They found nothing, and eventually, we all went back to sleep. Around that time, there was a show on TV called Freakazoid, and the boogeyman character was called Candlejack, so that's what I decided to call my strange visitor. He became somewhat of an imaginary friend after that, although I'm not sure how imaginary he really was. It was right after this that I began to feel presence, and still do to this day. I could always tell when it was Candlejack specifically who was around, and others could tell also. I would tell my mother or grandparents, "Oh, Candlejack is here," or would make them set an extra place at the table because he was with me and would need somewhere to sit. I remember very clearly how uncomfortable this seemed to make everyone, particularly my mother, and I learned later in life that it was because they could all feel it too. My brothers would not come near me when I was playing with Candlejack. My mom said the room would get cold and stale, and she would get a nauseated feeling when he was around. As time wore on, I began to be afraid of his presence, and thought that if I didn't do things to make him happy and feel included, he would get angry and hurt me. even though I still felt him around. I began to tell everyone he wasn't there, or that he went off to college. I persistently ignored him until one day, he went away for good. To this day, whenever he is brought up amongst my family, everyone still talks about how absolutely terrified they were of Candlejack and their separate experiences with him. I will never know if I was visited by something or if it was just my overactive imagination and the power of suggestion that was scaring everyone else. But I hope that I never see or feel him around me again." End quote. Reddit user BarbaJan319 posted, quote, "I have no recollection of this. I remember part of my life before and after this story, but I have no memory of my life living in this house. This story I know from what my mom and siblings have told me. Back when I was about 4 to 5 years old, me and my family went to live from Buenos Aires to Saltillo, Mexico. My father had just got a big promotion, so he bought a big 3-story house, a beautiful and antique house. As soon as we moved into the house, I told my mother that I had met 5 boys who were now my friends. As a kid with an active imagination, my mom didn't think much of it. Later, she started noticing strange behavior from me and my friends. The first thing she noticed was that my friend was not allowed to come down from the 2nd floor. I would spend hours begging them to please come down and play with me on the 1st floor in the living room. I would tell my mom that they couldn't, or they would get in trouble with the man in the black hat. After a few months, things started getting stranger. My mom would sometimes hear children laughing and footsteps on the top floor. She then assumed that maybe my imaginary friends were not that imaginary. One night, when my father was out of town, I went to sleep with my mom on her bed. In the middle of the night, I woke her up to tell her that my friends had gotten angry with me. They were angry, and they wanted to hurt me. I was screaming at my mom to please help me. I was crying, telling her to please help me because they wanted to take me now. "Please, Mom, help me. They are coming for me. They sent the man in the black hat. Please, I don't want to go." My mom told me that she grabbed me tight, closed her eyes, and prayed for me to just fall asleep. But I didn't. I was telling her to look out the window and see the man. Look at his red eyes. 10 minutes passed, and I stopped crying. I calmly told her that the man was now in the hallway, and that I would be going with him. She went and locked the bedroom door, held me tight with her hand on my mouth, and closed my eyes until I drifted off into sleep. She didn't sleep until daytime. That morning, she called my father and told him that she could no longer live in this house. It took 2 months for us to find a new place to live. As soon as I left the house, I no longer talked about my friends, and apparently forgot all about them. There were many other things that happened during our stay at that house, but I wanted to tell you that this was the most intense for my family. End quote. And finally, Reddit user AngelFox1 posted, quote, "Have you ever had an imaginary friend as a child that might have been a ghost? When I was a kid, about 3 years old, I had a friend that my mom said was imaginary, or at least she thought she was. We lived out in the boonies, and the closest house was like 2 miles away. My friend's name was Skipper, and he was older than me. There was an old tree in the backyard that had fallen over. He would sit in the tree higher than I could climb, and we'd talk. He had dark hair, and I remember he had black eyes. Not just the eyes themselves, but it was like he had black eyeshadow all around them. he smelled like our fireplace. And he knew things, like why my mom and dad were fighting, or about how the window upstairs got broken by a bird flying into it. He also said the snakes in the basement came up out of the swamps only during storms, but never to go down there, or I'd get bitten. I found out later that there was a house down the road that had burnt down. Mom said one of the boys died from smoke inhalation. I often wonder Skipper wasn't that boy. End quote. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, I'll admit that I've seen enough paranormal stuff to know better than to dismiss the possibility of malevolent imaginary friends. And though I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I do think it's possible for invading spirits to disguise themselves as pretend friends. Of course, it's likely that most imaginary friends are exactly that. Figments of a child's imagination. But still, what if they're not? After all this, we're still left with these questions. What if evil and demonic spirits come in the form of imaginary friends and cozy up next to my and your kids? Is it possible that some imaginary companions are neither imaginary nor friendly? I've shared the details. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.